Hi, everyone, and greetings from quarantine. My name is Misha Teramura. I teach Shakespeare in the Department of English at the University of Toronto, and I'm so excited to get to talk to you today about A Midsummer Night's Dream. This might be Shakespeare's best loved play. It's certainly among the most frequently performed. One reason I think is that it has a reputation for being the most entertaining, the most accessible, and maybe even the most kid-friendly of Shakespeare's plays. It's often the text by which young people are introduced to Shakespeare in schools. So if you've been reading along with the Shakespeare 2020 project, A Midsummer Night's Dream might very well be a play that you've read before, that you've seen on stage. It might be a play that you think you already know. But this is a play that looks very different every time you revisit it. Things that might have seemed funny or charming on first reading might seem serious or even disturbing when you return. The play is itself almost like a dream. There's always something beneath the surface, and it's always open to interpretation. Now, historically, directors and performers have often chosen to emphasize the pleasures that the play has to offer. One example of this is how beautifully it pulls off the theatrical trick of juggling the three clusters of very different characters. The frustrated young lovers, Hermia, Helena, Lysander, and Demetrius, the Athenian craftsmen turned amateur actors, headed by the voracious Nick Bottom, and the diminutive yet formidable fairies, led by their queen and king, Titania and Oberon. So at the level of plot, one of the pleasures of this play comes in seeing what happens when these three very different worlds collide. Another pleasure is the play's language. In this play, we get some incredibly sumptuous descriptions of the natural and supernatural world, such as Oberon's description of the bank where the wild thyme blows with its nodding violet and luscious woodbine. We get imagery of elves hiding in acorn cups, of a mermaid singing on a dolphin's back. The language of the play seems designed to cast a kind of spell over the imaginations of readers and audiences. Another pleasure of the play comes in its handling of comedy. Unlike the dense and difficult 16th century wordplay that we find elsewhere in Shakespeare, the varieties of comedy in A Midsummer Night's Dream tend to translate very well for modern audiences, from the comic chaos of the lovers' confusion to that really delicious pastiche of tragedy in the final performance of Pyramus and Thisbe. So one way to experience A Midsummer Night's Dream is to focus on these kinds of pleasures, but it also encourages you to notice the play's darker sides as well. In the opening scene, Lysander gives us an important line: "The course of true love never did run smooth." He's referring here to the turbulent trials that lovers must undergo before they can live happily ever after. But this is a play that treats the very idea of love as a philosophical problem. What is love? How do people express love? And how do people act when they're in love? Or maybe more importantly, when they think they're in love? Can you be wrong about love? The more I read this play, the more I think of it as an exploration of the landscape of erotic desire, one that takes us to some extremely disturbing places. As you read this play, I'd encourage you to keep at the forefront of your mind the idea of consent. If you do, you'll notice that from the very opening lines until the end, basically every scene in this play is darkened by elements of sexual coercion, even sexual violence. It comes up in the backstory of characters such as Theseus and Hippolyta, in allusions to classical mythology, in veiled threats, in metaphorical language. Read the text closely and see if you can keep track of these moments, whether they're on the surface or lurking just beneath. Why do we learn so much about how the love juice gets created? Why does Hermia have a dream about a serpent eating her heart? And beyond language, consider what the lens of consent reveals about the very actions that we watch in this play, even those that might seem to be the most comedic. If the performance of Pyramus and Thisbe in the final act shows us a tragedy that seems like a comedy, I'd encourage you to think about how the conclusion of A Midsummer Night's Dream might not be so funny. What are the costs of this conclusion? What facts need to be swept behind the door for this to feel like a happy ending? This is one of my favorite plays precisely because it's so densely packed with questions like these, and because directors and performers have tackled these questions in so many different ways. Consider the fairies. Victorian versions of Shakespeare tended to emphasize the quaint and picturesque qualities of the fairies, imagining them as exquisite, pretty creatures. But more recent productions have made different choices, drawing instead on imagery such as insects, warlords, demigods, and famous figures from history. As you read, think about how your understanding of this play changes if you visualize the fairies in different ways. Some other things you might consider as you read. Consider how the play addresses the relationship between humans and the natural world. In one of the first scenes of the play, we learn that because Titania and Oberon are at war, the entire natural world is in a state of ecological crisis. The normal seasons are out of order. Rising water levels have caused an agricultural disaster. Changes in air quality have led to mass disease. As you read this play, see if you can track how it develops this theme about the relationship between humans and the natural world. Another really juicy theme here is transformation. One of Shakespeare's very favorite books seems to have been The Metamorphoses, a long poem by the Roman poet Ovid that weaves together tales of transformation from classical mythology, stories of bodies becoming other bodies. You might think about A Midsummer Night's Dream as Shakespeare's own kaleidoscopic exploration of changes and transformations, whether literal or metaphorical. So as you read, watch out for all the variations on this theme that you can find. Now, if you're a Shakespeare enthusiast, one of the really fun things about this play is that Shakespeare shows us how a play gets made, how actors get matched with parts, how kinks get worked out in rehearsal, how actors need to deal with curveballs on opening night. Now, of course, the show that Peter Quince and his troupe put on might not seem like the highest standard of theatrical achievement, but consider how Shakespeare uses this play within a play to explore the role of theater on the lives of performers and on the audience. So I hope you have a great time experiencing this fascinating play, whether it's for the first time or for the 50th. So happy reading and stay safe, everyone.